news. I'm sure probably most of you in this room have had enough of fake news. You don't even know what is true anymore. You look at me here, you're not quite sure whether this is all fake or not. Well, let me tell you, the panel discussion about to join us here on stage, there is nothing fake about these guys at all. They're going to make sense of how did we get to it as it is right now. Social media started off, it's all about trust, all about connecting, all about transparency, but now today, as it is today, it's kind of topped on its head. We're going to see how we're going to kind of switch it back to where it should be going and the right direction as well. And the gentleman who's going to put this all together with his panel, please welcome to the stage the media partnerships and cultural discovery platform, Bookwati, the man himself, Mr. Nasri Attallah.
Thank you. So he pretty much said everything we need to say to introduce the subject. I'm joined by Ahmed Shihab-eldin from AJ+, Sarah Yassin from BuzzFeed News, and we have an extra addition to the panel, which is Kim Ghattas from the BBC. Sadly, she's not up on here on the screen, but you have her in person. So I'm going to sit on this throne here.
Yeah, you're sitting on the big chair.
So, fake news has been the kind of favorite word everyone's been using last year, this year. It's very much in vogue, but I'm interested to know what you guys think, like in terms of definitions. Like, what are we talking about when we talk about fake news? Is it 1,000 guys in Russia building fake content on the part of a state, or are we talking about bored kids in Macedonia putting together something for money? Sarah.
So I think that there are different things that we are talking about when we talk about fake news. There's a difference between journalists not doing a good job when they're putting together a story and something going viral that isn't necessarily accurate or true. There's a difference between that and a story that's completely made up no matter what the intention is. Those are like two completely different things. And I think during this time period, fake news has meant, you know, the kind of stories that have been made up to like take advantage of the hyper-partisan environment in the US right now.
I think as well it's a combination of things, but it is a term that is being used by a lot of people, including politicians, to dismiss whatever coverage of themselves that they don't like, right? So the minute that someone doesn't like the story on a certain outlet, they'll say, oh, you're fake news. And I think it is important to educate people about what the term actually means and what it doesn't mean. And I think that fake news can be, as Sarah mentioned, stories that are completely made up for a specific reason, either by a state entity or non-state actors with a specific political purpose or for fun sometimes. We've seen some stories, some very fake stories in the US take off during the election cycle. And then you have propaganda. And propaganda is, in a way, the predecessor of fake news. And it's something that we're very familiar with in various regions of the world, including in the Arab world. So the term fake news, in a way, is not new, but it is being used in a new way.
It's been appropriated.
It's been appropriated by a lot of people.
And I think, when we talk about fake news, it's really just a symptom of a much deeper illness that exists in society, which is a lack of trust. There is an erosion, especially in America, when it comes to the things that are supposed to protect us, like our government, like institutions, like our elected officials. There's a collective sense, and I think it's been building for many years, that we can't trust these institutions. And even though I don't have slides, I wore this shirt today because it says our voice is the only thing that can protect us. And especially when you talk about fake news, as journalists, I think this lack of trust started in 2007 with the banking crisis. It's been building since then, and it's really important what Kim mentioned in terms of accountability. We've seen from the very high levels of power, not only has lying been institutionalized, but this complete lack of accountability, obfuscations, avoiding any responsibility for actions or words. And Facebook and social media sites, as you know, Nasri, play a big role in how we all get our news, and that's the real danger. Because when there's trust, when there's a lack of trust and a deep erosion of trust, what we end up doing is we look for things that confirm our own bias. Like when you guys share something on Facebook, you don't share it because it's true. You share it probably because you're like, yes, yes, I hate Trump. You agree with it.
But I'd say that it started earlier than the banking crisis, because I think that what happened with the Iraq war in 2003 and the coverage of that, and the sense that perhaps journalists did not do enough to dig and
like
push
the dossier, the fake
prod,
dossiers and the
that hurt the credibility of journalism to some extent. But I do think that we need to go back to the basics of good old-fashioned fact-based reporting and explain to people as the media that our role is to hold those in power to account. And so,
but actually,
you know, there might be a lack of trust in institutions, but that's where we as the media also
this
come
brings
in.
me to actually
But Nasri, if I can just very quickly, forgive me, because when we talk about this, I agree with you, Kim, but what you've seen is, you know, for example, in the US, the lowest approval ratings are for the mainstream media and for Congress. And that's what I mean about, you know, the responsibility of journalists. Sure, we should be reporting, but people don't believe us to begin with, and that's why we're in this situation.
Journalists are perceived to be part of the establishment and towing the establishment line even. But the question is, like, are media companies, are journalists in a way, I don't want to say, I'm going to say responsible for, I mean, you know, like, there's also a kind of economic situation where, for example, websites have to chase clicks and traffic to stay alive.
Yeah, the clickbait model.
The clickbait model, or just the, like, you know, let's get it out and then fact check it, print a retraction after we've had time to put it out.
Yeah, there's a pressure to publish.
Yeah, so is there that pressure, is there a way to, like, deal with that pressure and at the same time maintain, like, fact checking standards?
So I think that BuzzFeed actually is a place that does a lot of that kind of stuff really well, where we have good traffic, but then also, you know, every story that you see on BuzzFeed, whether it's, you know, a deep investigation down to, like, you know, this picture of this teenager is going viral because, you know, she made a really cool prom dress. The reporter that's working on that story is held to the same standard as the person who's doing the deep dive investigation. And that's why I think the whole concept of, you know, using reporting and fact-based journalism as a way to combat some of this is really important, is because you need to make sure that you're holding yourself to a certain standard of credibility. But I think that you have to remember that we exist on the internet, and people want to read about cats, people want to read about these things. But we just have to, like, apply those principles to the world of information that we're in.
We don't do cats just yet at the BBC. and I do want to say, you know, I'm speaking in my personal capacity. But I do think that, you know, there is this tendency these days to dismiss experts, right? All experts are bad. Bring down the establishment. You know, I would like anyone in this room to tell me whether they'd be willing to go to a neurosurgeon to fix their car, or go to a car mechanic to get their teeth pulled out. I mean, there is at some point also the need to go back to common sense and critical thinking about what it is that we are ingesting and why we have this knee-jerk reaction to expertise. And as journalists, I think we also need to admit when we simply don't know. And I think we don't do that enough.
I agree, and I think as journalists, we also have to, as much as we want to talk about aspiring to objectivity and getting to fact-based reporting, the reality is that if we do the reporting and people aren't seeking out the truth, people don't share the truth on these platforms, which, for example, with Facebook, it has 1 billion and 700 million users, right? 60% of those users get their news primarily on Facebook. Facebook doesn't care about the truth. Facebook is, in all actuality, a media company,
yeah, actually, that brings up, like, what is the responsibility of these platforms who still maintain that they are technology platforms? What is their responsibility? Because now today they're gateways.
And that's a whole another panel maybe that we should have. But what I was saying is, Kim, as you know, like, if we put out real news, but it's competing on these platforms with whether it's cats or something, you know, more tedious and frivolous, again, people are looking to confirm.
Cats are serious.
Cats are serious, that's true. She can give you a lengthy lesson as to why.
Cats give you a break from all the news, I can see.
Yes, they certainly do. But again, what I was saying is, even if we do that reporting, people aren't seeking out the truth. So chances are, if you look back on your life and you think of all the facts and all the truths you know, it's not necessarily that you sought them out. Oftentimes you need a human or someone to make you care about that truth or that fact. And I think that's where journalists should be more honest, as Kim is saying, with themselves about our limitations and our abilities. But also, I believe that if the three of us were to arrive at a crime scene, by virtue of the fact that you're a woman, you're also a woman, and I'm not a woman alone, regardless of all of our other differences in terms of our compounded identities, we're going to report that story differently. Maybe I'll put something up high that you will completely not include in the story. So the idea of truth is very relative, and that's what's allowed us to get to this point where people are just searching for what confirms their bias. I mean, the reason you share something on Facebook is because your friends or family, people you trust, as compared with the media or other institutions.
Do you think it's a problem of the medium? So the media, I mean, like platforms only exist since 2004. We were discussing earlier. So like, a lot of these things are a decade old. The rolling news cycle, 24-hour news cycle is also like a couple of decades old. Are we still getting to grips with the medium itself? Because it took people a long time to see through propaganda in print and on TV. And are we now getting to the stage where people are seeing through and like we're in this adjustment phase, like the birth pang of maybe a few years of people, and we'll come back in the cycle?
I think so. I mean, I must disagree with you a little bit because, you know, I speak to colleges and universities and high school students in the US, and the first question I get is, how do we make sense of the deluge of news, right? And so people are going onto Facebook or getting their news from Twitter, and they're getting confused because younger generations don't have the necessary media literacy skills to differentiate between what is a reliable news source and what is not. And it takes very little, actually, to guide them through that. But I think it is essential, and it needs to be done in high schools in the US and around the world.
Kind of a new form of civics training.
Yeah. And then on the point of, you know, are we just now getting to grips with what this you know, mushrooming of platforms has meant for the news, and how do we move forward from here? I do think that because I'm getting these questions, because we're sitting here discussing fake news and what it means, that we are reaching a point where people are, I hope, getting a little bit tired of this deluge, and they just want a little bit more guidance as to what makes something factually correct, and how do they differentiate between what is a reliable source and what is not.
And I know that it's a controversial issue, but this is why I believe that journalists should know their own truth. And our truth, by that I mean, is our identities affect and our experiences how we perceive a story. And there's long been this belief that objectivity and aspiring to objectivity is important. I think in this barrage where there's so much information out there, people are likely to trust you if they view you as transparent. Credibility is whether it's because I'm personable or I'm honest about, you know, certain beliefs or perspectives.
But do they trust the journalist, or do they trust the media, the media entity through which a journalist is channeling the information?
I think increasingly they're trusting individuals, because what we've seen is kind of the decentralization of news. There's blogs, there's social feeds, there's all kinds of ways in which people get information that unfortunately you're starting to see some of these mainstream companies also play in that arena. And I think that only creates a more kind of compounded inability and a kind of schizophrenia. So people default back. I mean, you guys are all here. When you guys see something on Facebook, you're going to share it if, like, Sultan Al-Qasimi is not here, but I know that he's quite well known here. People share his things because, oh, if Sultan shared it, then it must kind of, sort of, probably be true because I trust Sultan. But
they're
do you
trusting
think
him
to
to
fact
do
check
the
it?
due diligence on what he's sharing. So maybe there are new gateways. They're trusting someone like Sultan, someone like you guys to say, okay, like, I've done the fact checking, so you maybe don't have to. And like, it's a different kind of entity replacing the kind of 5 or 6 gates we used to have.
I mean, I think that the thing, though, is that people should, I mean, I think we're going to have to move more into a point where, like, people are starting to feel like they need to have the skills to look at a story and be able to tell if it's true or not. Because I think probably before the internet too, people were hearing stories on the news or seeing it on TV and thinking that it was true because they were seeing it in front of them. So I think, like, you know, as we've talked about now and previously, you know, some of these things are age-old problems. And I mean,
but they're compounded by the technology and
Yeah,
the social
absolutely.
media. That's the problem.
yeah, and so it makes it spread faster, and it makes things that aren't true, like, just even more like just I don't know. It feels like these things are just so hectic, and I think that people just need to be more educated with it.
But Sarah, do you think that we're maybe also like kind of gripped by a stage of moral panic, where maybe it's unjustified how terrified we are, and maybe it's not that big of a phenomenon? Like, a lot of studies show that actually the influence, like people talk about the election a lot in the US, and you look at the actual influence, it might not be there, and it's more of just like a fear of where it might lead. Like, is it just a moral panic, and this is something that'll pass?
I mean, I think yes and no. I mean, I think that it is worrying that, you know, you have these stories spreading where, you know, for example, there's an entire fake news site that is devoted to fake stories about Muslims. Like, that is its bread and butter. And when these stories spread, they have very real impact. They help dehumanize people.
And this is why I think humanizing not Muslims, but in this case, a marginalized community, by merely existing and humanizing them, it provides a piece of truth, right? Because context, at the end of the day, in this barrage of information is truth, or can reveal something about the truth. And, you know, we've kind of been talking a lot about America because I think we're all kind of aghast at what's happening and the world's being affected. But, you know, 5 years ago in the Arab world, there was a critical moment of, you know, Arab uprisings all around the region. And there was, for those of us who were using social media and the internet to report in ways that had previously never happened, I think it's important to mention that once we started to see the decentralization of media, we all thought that that would inevitably lead to you online coming across an opinion or a view or a story or a perspective that you didn't agree with. This comes back to confirmation bias and the reality of the internet. What we've seen, you know, is it perception or reality? The reality is, with more stuff on the internet coming, more different opinions, we're starting to filter out, whether consciously or not, the stuff that we don't want to see because there's so much coming at us. So in a sense, a moment where we thought the decentralization of media, and in the Middle East, you know, I 5 years ago was probably sitting on a stage not so far from here talking about how the democratization of media is going to be directly related to the democratization of the Arab world. And yet, now 5 years later in America, and even here in the Middle East, as we were talking backstage, the opposite has happened. Democracy is very much under threat in America by virtue of the fact that people don't distinguish between what's real and what's perceived, and more importantly, they don't seek out facts. They seek out, again, things that confirm their bias. And I believe that that's human nature, and it's only being compounded by social media.
I think that, you know, I've covered the Middle East extensively. I'm now based in Washington. I've covered the US for the last 6-7 years. I think that one of the issues in the US and by extension in other parts of the world is that there is no distinction drawn anymore between opinion and reporting. And I think that is confusing people.
Can we come back from that?
You know, it's going to take a long time. I think it takes a lot of work. But when you turn on the TV in the United States and you listen to the TV shows, it's unclear whether these people are talking facts or talking opinions.
It's a shouting match,
It's all conjecture, right?
So I think that is very confusing for people. The other point I want to make, going back to what Sarah was mentioning, about the real impact on people's lives of fake news, is that we've seen how that, before even social media, how that has an impact in, you know, countries like Egypt or Pakistan, when stories take off that are planted by state actors or non-state actors for a specific purpose to dehumanize a community, to vilify a person, it can lead to violence.
Of course.
And we've seen that happen in those countries, and it's very hard to come back from that. And I think that that's what's worrying about what we're seeing in the United States. I don't know if you've heard of Pizzagate, where there were a lot of fake stories planted in the US media about a pizzeria in Washington, which was somehow connected, via to Hillary Clinton, and there were allegations of a pedophilia ring in the basement. Some man reads this outside of Washington, decides he needs to go save the children, brings a gun, barges into the pizzeria, and a few shots ring out. Luckily, no one is hurt. And of course, to his surprise, there were no children being locked up in that basement. So that's why we all have a responsibility, I think, to make sure that this phenomena is contained.
And that's an interesting case, because I think that was one of the rumors that was spread by InfoWars, which is a particularly conspiratorial site.
But like I said, it happens everywhere. I mean, you look at the coverage
but they
in
even
Pakistan
stepped back
or in
from that
Egypt.
story. They even stepped back themselves. Like this conspiratorial website said, okay, no, we misreported that, because they even saw the real world impact, and it becomes a bit more tangible that
words have consequences,
exactly.
and we very often forget that.
And Kim, this just quickly I want to mention goes back to the responsibility of platforms like Facebook. I mean, I don't think we can say it enough. I mean, don't get me wrong. If any of you have seen my work, chances are you've seen it on Facebook, because that's one of the biggest platforms for good reason. But this monetization model, Facebook, again, doesn't care about the facts. Facebook doesn't care if that pizza story was...
They're starting to.
I would like to believe that.
For commercial reasons, they have to.
Yeah,
because otherwise they'll see an exodus of users.
I don't think that's true. I mean, we can agree on, but it's too big a user base to see an exodus. You're going to see 1,700,000,000 people leave because Mark Zuckerberg says that he's not a media organization. The only reason I say this is if everyone wasn't playing in this space, then it would be easier without media literacy for an audience to distinguish between what is news, as you say, which is factually reported, and then what you watch on CNN and all these channels where there's a lot of conjecture because they're just trying to make money.
I think our time is up, but I just want to go around really quickly. This is going to sound ridiculous, but really quickly, how are we going to solve this? But just on a personal level, as a part of a news team, what are you going to do? The one thing to resolve this issue. What is going to be your contribution to alleviating this problem?
I mean, I work in breaking news and specifically in things like push alerts and social media and that kind of thing. So we're the people who are most likely going we're at the front of that conversation. And I would say the biggest thing that we do is we go on the level of our audience. We speak about things that we know that they care about, but then also we are really rigorous in fact checking and making sure that we're never going to tweet the photo of someone that is allegedly, an attacker in something unless we know for sure.
Yeah.
For example, that's one of the many things that we do on our level.
Kim?
I don't pretend to solve the industry's problems, but on a personal level, I think I'll just continue doing what I've done for the last 20 years, which is be a good reporter, always ask the right questions or try to ask the right questions, listen to the answers, listen to all sides, and that's important when we're doing our reporting. Listen to all sides, interview all sides. And then on a personal level, I also go out a lot and speak to community colleges in the US, to students, to high schools, in the Arab world, wherever I go, and try to educate them about fact-based reporting and about seeking out proper sources for what they're reading. And it's up to every single one of us is not to spread a story, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's on Facebook, without having first checked whether there is a secondary source that you can use to make sure that it is accurate. I think that is all of our responsibility.
Ahmed,
And,
quickly.
Very quickly, as Kim said, I think we need to focus on transparency, on accountability, demanding that organizations and people who are reporting and telling stories are held accountable themselves. And quite frankly, I think we live in a time where we need more adversarial journalism. And I think the problem is that there's a lot of people who are willing to compromise real hardcore reporting, for lack of a better term.
That becomes advocacy, and that's different from journalism.
Yeah, it is different, but I think we can't compromise that, and we're seeing it happen a lot. So stick to humanizing characters and being transparent and accountable.
Excellent. Well, on that note, I'm getting waved off at the back. So thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. See you later.